Was this not wonderful? Oh my gosh. I don't go to too many churches and get to hear jazz. It was so good. You guys are unbelievable. Well, guess what? I've been here 3 times, and every time I've just told you a story. I was going to preach a regular sermon today, but I couldn't help myself. You're going to get another story. The title of today's sermon is God Comes to Us Disguised as Your Life. And this is a popular quote often attributed to Richard Rohr, but our words today from a modern-day prophet reveal it is actually a quote by Paula d'Arcy. The quote suggests that God's presence is not always obvious or easy to recognize, but is rather revealed through the ordinary, sometimes difficult, circumstances of life. I may have shared with you in a prior sermon that in 1974 and 75, at the age of 22, I lived 9 months in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Most of the time, I lived on what was called the Ark, two houseboats in the harbor of Amsterdam, which were part of a ministry called Dilaram. Dilaram had houses in Kathmandu, Nepal, Kabul, Afghanistan, and New Delhi, India. While there, I spent a couple of months on the hardcore mobile team. We lived in the city with all the world travelers and hippies. How many of you can remember the late 60s and early 70s? We camped out in Vondel Park and slept under plastic bags, and we sat around in circles and talked to all the travelers. And if it was raining, we would sleep in temporary shelters throughout the city. And one of the things I will always remember about my time in Holland was sitting in the houseboats, all of us hippies and world travelers. And how many of you have ever read the book, The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom? Corrie ten Boom was in prison during World War II. Her father and her sister died in a concentration camp. And I will never forget all of us hippies sitting around her at the age of 42 and her telling us her story. It was amazing. In December of 1974, I was selected to relieve the Teen Challenge leader of a Christian coffee bar in the red light district of Amsterdam. Anybody ever been to Amsterdam? Oh my gosh, and you know what I'm talking about. He and his family needed a break, and the Dilaram leadership must have thought I needed the experience. On one side of the coffee bar, there was a sex shop, a drugstore, selling marijuana and hashish and all that anyone would want. And on the other side was a house with a large window where a provocatively dressed young woman sat to attract customers. Now, I spent a month there, and the only thing I remember is a guy coming in high once and told me he was going to kill me. And I remember taking him aside and saying, I really wish you wouldn't. Can we just talk about life? By February, after 8 months, I needed a break. I was also experiencing a minor health issue. And the leader of the Ark, Floyd McClung, became aware of a property on the coast of North Devon in England where I could get some much-needed rest. Living on the Ark at the time was a young man named Jerry that the Dilaram ministry had rescued from the drug scene in Amsterdam. As I already said, in the late 60s and early 70s, Europe and the Far East were awash in what we called world travelers. Some world travelers were looking for enlightenment, and some were looking for easy access to drugs. Jerry, believe it or not, was the 14th child of an Irish Catholic family. He was amiable, friendly, and full of gratitude. He had accepted Jesus as his Lord and Savior. But he did have one major issue. His teeth had been ruined by neglect and the drugs he had been using. His dental repairs in Amsterdam would be cost prohibitive. And so the leader of the Ark determined that Jerry should travel with me to England, where I would drop him off in another Christian community. In England, since he was an Irish citizen, he could have his teeth fixed for free. Now, the night before we were to take the ferry from Amsterdam to Dover, England, I was a wreck. I was stressed out, worn out. I'd actually broken out in hives. I really needed a 2-week vacation. And while I lay in my bunk trying to rest, Jerry came to me. He wanted me to know that he had trouble in England. The Dilaram ministry taught that we should make restitution with those we had wronged. And Jerry, being a sincere new Christian, I assumed he had some repair work to do. I quickly assured him that he could make restitution with anyone he had wronged on another trip. This trip would simply be for the purpose of having his teeth fixed. He was puzzled by my reply, but he did not argue with me. The next day, we took the ferry from Amsterdam and landed in Dover, England. And while going through customs, the person checking Jerry's passport told us to wait. Soon after, a person in uniform came and took Jerry into a room behind closed doors. All I could do was wait. The wait seemed like an eternity. And eventually the door opened and Jerry appeared in handcuffs and leg irons. I will never forget the look on his face and his gesture and what he said. "David, I tried to tell you I have trouble in England." Yes, God comes disguised as our lives. After they took Jerry away, I got someone to tell me where they were taking him. I was given the name of a police station in London. I had not planned to go to London, but given Jerry's arrest, I got on a train to London. I thought Amsterdam was a big city. London was beyond anything I had ever experienced in my life. Remember, I'm 22 years old and had never been anywhere. The first night I found a bunk in a hostel, or what we would call a flop house. The person in the bunk below me was high on drugs, and for the second time in 3 months, he told me he was going to kill me. I don't think I slept a wink. The next day, I found the police station, discovered that Jerry was not there. A mistake had been made. My memory is a little fuzzy, but somehow I found my way to the right police station, and once there, I learned that Jerry had already been taken to prison. On this first full day in London, I decided I needed other lodging. And I found a B&B in a nice neighborhood ran by a kind elderly lady. Over the next few days, I met Jerry's public defender, or as they say in London, public solicitor. I also walked the streets of London. Riding the subway was like being in a sardine in a can. In those few days, I saw all the sights: Buckingham Palace, House of Parliament. I did not feel free to spend any money, so I just looked at things from the outside. But I did watch the changing of the guard. Even though it was February, I have never seen so many people walking the streets. I just couldn't believe the size of this city. Oh, and one night I did visit a pub and tried an English beer. I learned from Jerry's solicitor, while living in London, Jerry had been living in a house inhabited by drug users. The house was raided by police. Jerry had answered the door, and when they arrived, a police officer had cut his hand badly on the glass window on the door. Jerry had been charged with assaulting a police officer and, yes, had jumped bail and gone to Amsterdam. I also learned Jerry would be going to trial very quickly. And finally, after 2 or 3 days, I went to the prison where Jerry was located to visit him. Remember, I had gone to England to hopefully rest and heal for at least 2 weeks. Instead, I was a stressed out 22-year-old feeling responsible for Jerry's incarceration. He tried to tell me I have trouble in England, David. Another unforgettable memory is when I went to the prison to visit Jerry. He walked through the door into the visiting area. He appeared rested and with a huge smile on his face. He came bouncing across the room, and when he sat down across from me, he blurted out, "Ah, David, this place is wonderful. I'm getting 3 good meals a day, and I'm telling the person sharing my cell all about the love of Jesus." I assure you, I could not share Jerry's enthusiasm. The only other thing I remember from the visit is that I told Jerry he had a solicitor and I would be at his trial. God comes disguised as our lives. The next day, I was to travel to Lee Abbey, the name of the small house I imagined on the coast of England, where I could rest. I took a train from London, got on a bus somewhere, and while on the bus, I remember looking out the window just as we were going past the Stonehenge. I do not remember the village that was the bus's destination, but from there I took a taxi to Lee Abbey. The taxi driver let me out in the middle of nowhere and told me that Lee Abbey was about a quarter of a mile up the road. I would have to walk the rest of the way. Remember, I'm imagining a 2-story house, hopefully close to the water. When I went around the bend, I could not believe what loomed in front of me. A picture of Lee Abbey is on the cover of your bulletins. I was expected. Prior arrangements had been made. I explained that I could not stay as long as planned. It was the off-season, no conferences or retreats. And for the 4 days that I was at Lee Abbey, there were only 4 guests. 2 young nurses from London, a depressed Anglican priest, and myself. I rested as best I could, walked the cliffs along the ocean, and at night played cards and games with the other 3 guests. One thing happened at Lee Abbey that, looking back, I now believe changed the course of my life. One night, there was a healing service for the priest. The nurses and I sat in the balcony because we had all become friends. And in the church in which I was raised, healing services were kind of chaotic. Loud and speaking in tongues and people being what we call slain in the spirit. A form of prostration in which an individual falls to the floor while experiencing religious ecstasy. This service was 180 degrees from how I had experienced healing services growing up. The service was quiet. The Anglican priest spoke softly. He gently laid his hands on the depressed priest while praying a beautiful and meaningful prayer. The nurses and I came away from the service deeply moved. Looking back, I think this was the moment that I realized that however my life unfolded, it would not be in the tradition in which I was raised. I'd experienced something entirely different. God comes to us disguised as our lives. When it came time to leave Lee Abbey, the nurses were also leaving and offered me a ride back to London to save money. And on the way, guess what? One of them got the idea that I could stay with her and her parents. Why spend the money on another B&B? We arrived at this upper middle-class home somewhere in London. At the door, we were greeted by her parents. This was before cell phones. They did not know I was coming. Remember, I was a world traveler living in a Christian community, ministering to world travelers. I had hair then, and it was pretty long. I had a beard down to here, and I was dressed like a hippie, and I even carried a purse. The door opened, and the young nurse blurted out, "This is David. I met him at Lee Abbey. I invited him to stay with us a few days. His friend's in prison, and he needs to attend the trial." I wish you could have seen the look on their faces. In the end, they were gracious and attentive to me while I stayed with them. I will never forget how proper the meals were, and dinner always began with a cocktail. Now, I assure you, I never experienced that in my life. It was another world. God comes to us disguised as our lives. The trial. The judge and solicitors all wore robes and white wigs. Anybody ever been to a courthouse in England? I couldn't believe it. The policeman that Jerry had supposedly assaulted was about 6'5" and 250 pounds. Jerry was maybe 5'6" and might have weighed 100 pounds, and he had a full head of curly hair. Jerry was in the dock, and the policeman sat a few rows behind Jerry with a menacing look on his face. And ever so often, Jerry would turn around and smile at the policeman. And I'll never forget Jerry looking at him and saying, "Jesus loves you." The door to the flop house was locked when Jerry answered the door. Jerry was accused of slamming the door, and the officer's hand went through the glass. The case hinged on the length of the chain on the lock. At one point, Jerry's solicitor made the case that she could not understand how the typical length would have been long enough to create the force necessary for the officer's hand to go through the glass window. And so she asked at one point of the officer, "How long was the chain?" And he replied, 12 to 16 inches. The solicitor looked puzzled and then made the argument, "This is nonsensical. If the chain was that long, you could have just easily reached around the door and unlocked it." She then suggested to the court that Jerry did not slam the door. No, the police officer on his own accord probably broke the window so he could reach through and unlock the little chain, and in doing so, he cut himself. Guess what? Jerry was acquitted. When he stood before the judge, he was told he was free to go. And then the judge reminded him that there was an additional problem. Jerry had jumped bail and left the country. For jumping bail, the judge fined him 50 pounds. So, my friends, who do you think had 50 pounds to pay the fine? Yours truly. No wonder I'd been so hesitant to spend money the whole time I was in England. God comes to us disguised as our lives. I took Jerry to the sister community somewhere in the south of England where he could live while he had his dental work done. We said goodbye. I wished him well. I never saw him again. I spent a few days in one of the community members' home, sitting in front of a fire, eating bread, jelly, and butter. Paying Jerry's fine had pretty much depleted my financial resources. Eventually, I got back on a ferry in Dover and returned to Amsterdam. My medical issues had gotten worse. And even though the trip was memorable and life-changing, I was exhausted. And shortly after returning to Amsterdam, I returned to the United States. And the last time I was here, you heard about the year I spent in the United States when I met Curly. Some of you were probably here and remember that sermon. Before going to Amsterdam, I had taken the LSAT and law school entry exam. I did not do too well. And upon my return, I took the test again, and this time I did good enough to get into law school. That said, in the 9 months I spent in Dilaram, I decided against going to law school and wanted to give myself to full-time ministry. I finished a couple of college courses and graduated. It would be over a year before I went back to Europe and the Dilaram ministry. It would be 3 more years before I found myself in New England, all of your homes, and in seminary. God comes disguised as our lives. I tell you this story so that you can laugh with me at this young man, his eagerness and his naivete. I also tell the story to remember Jerry, the owner of the B&B, the public solicitor who defended Jerry. She was only about 2 years older than me. A depressed Anglican priest, 2 nurses, the bewildered, kind, and gracious parents of the young nurse, and a priest whose prayer of healing had a profound effect on the direction and course that my life would eventually take. All the names except Jerry's are gone from my memory, and I never saw any of them again. All this to say that life is our teacher. God comes disguised as your life. Sometimes we make mistakes and go through experiences that we cannot imagine. But the mystery uses them to shape the course of our lives. I long and trust and pray that my story has connected you to a memorable experience or experiences in your own life that changed your life. Remember, story sermons have to be yours. It's my story. They have to be true. It's true. And you tell them to connect the listener to their own story, their experiences, the times that changed their lives. I end my sermon today with a quote by Leon Blodder. God comes to you disguised as your life, so let God love you. This is the meaning of life after all. We are all loved. Isn't it amazing? And no matter what experiences we go through, we are never alone. And God uses them to draw us out and to draw us closer. Amen.